Before the first scream echoes through the halls, before a single secret slips from trembling lips, ask yourself, would you dare to unlock the attic door? Tonight, you're not just a viewer. You're an invited witness to a forbidden chapter that's been sealed for over 100 years. This is a story so chilling, so fiercely protected, that even the oldest families of Yorkshire speak of it only in hushed tones. 4 sisters, 1 forbidden oath, and a secret so powerful it wiped their family from the pages of history. If you crave the hidden, the haunted, and the truths other channels are too afraid to touch, subscribe now and stay with us, because what you're about to discover has never been revealed until this very night. The storm had been building all day, a slow, sullen pressure that pressed against the windows of Ashford Manor and made the old house groan in its bones. By nightfall, the sky was a bruise, and the rain came in sheets, lashing the glass and turning the gardens to a black, churning sea. Thunder rolled over the moors, and the wind howled down the chimneys, rattling the soot and making the flames in the hearth shudder and leap. In the flickering candlelight of the upstairs corridor, 4 sisters stood in their nightgowns, barefoot on the cold, creaking floorboards. Eleanor, the eldest at 17, held a brass candlestick high, her jaw set in a way that made her look older than her years. Beatrice, a year younger, clung to her arm, her eyes wide and dark as storm clouds. Lillian, always the quietest, hovered behind them, her hands twisting the hem of her nightdress, and Clara, the youngest, barely 12, shivered at the back, her hair a wild halo of gold in the candle's uncertain glow. They had all heard it, a sound that did not belong to the storm, a dragging, scraping, almost human sound coming from the attic at the end of the hall. It was not the first time. For weeks the sisters had whispered of footsteps overhead, of cold drafts, and the feeling of being watched, but tonight the noise was louder, more insistent, as if something or someone was desperate to be let out. Eleanor's hand was steady as she reached for the attic door. The key, heavy and ornate, hung from a ribbon around her neck. Their mother had given it to her on her 16th birthday with strict instructions. Never open the attic after dark. Never, unless you must. But their mother was gone now, buried in the family plot beneath the yew trees, and their father was away in London, chasing debts and ghosts of his own. The sisters gathered close, their breath mingling in the cold air. The candle guttered as Eleanor slid the key into the lock. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a reluctant groan, the door swung open. The attic was a world apart from the rest of the house. The air was thick with dust and secrets, the beams heavy with cobwebs. Old trunks and broken furniture loomed in the shadows. The rain drummed on the slate roof above, and the wind found every crack, making the candle flame dance. But it was not the wind that made the sisters draw back in fear. In the center of the attic, beneath the single, grimy window, something moved. It was a shape, small, hunched, wrapped in a tattered shawl. For a moment, it seemed to be nothing more than a pile of rags. Then it lifted its head, and the sisters saw a face, pale and sharp as bone, eyes black and bottomless. Clara whimpered. Beatrice gasped. Lillian pressed her hands to her mouth. Eleanor stepped forward, her voice trembling but strong. "Who are you? What do you want?" The figure did not answer. It only stared, and in that stare was a hunger, a grief, a rage that seemed to fill the room. The candle flickered, and the shadows writhed on the walls. Then, in a voice like the rustle of dead leaves, it spoke. "Promise me," it whispered. "Promise you'll never tell." The sisters clung to each other, their hearts pounding. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper. The figure's eyes glowed in the darkness. "Promise," it said again, louder now, the word echoing off the beams. Eleanor nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "We promise." One by one, the sisters repeated it, their voices weaving together in the gloom. "We promise. We promise. We promise." The figure smiled, a terrible, broken smile. The candle went out, plunging the attic into darkness. When the sisters stumbled back into the corridor, gasping and sobbing, the door slammed shut behind them. The key was hot in Eleanor's hand. She pressed it into Beatrice's palm, her own fingers shaking. "Hide it," she said. "No one must ever open that door again." Downstairs, the grandfather clock struck midnight. The storm raged on, but inside the house, a new silence had fallen, a silence thick with secrets and with fear. The sisters huddled together in Eleanor's room, their nightgowns damp with sweat and rain. They did not speak of what they had seen or what they had promised. But in the darkness, each of them knew. Something had changed. Something had been set loose. Outside, the wind screamed across the moors and the rain beat against the glass. In the attic, something waited, listening, patient as the grave. The storm passed, but its memory lingered in the bones of Ashford Manor. For days, the house seemed to hold its breath. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of rain and old wood, and the sisters moved through the corridors as if in a dream, their voices hushed, their eyes wary. Eleanor, once so sure of herself, now startled at every creak of the floorboards. She kept the curtains drawn in her room and the key to the attic hidden in a velvet pouch beneath her pillow. She told herself it was only a precaution, but at night she woke with the taste of iron in her mouth and the echo of that voice, "Promise me," ringing in her ears. Beatrice, who had always been the boldest, grew pale and thin. She spent hours in the garden, wandering among the tangled roses and overgrown yews, her hands trailing through the wet grass. Sometimes she would stop and stare up at the attic window, her lips moving in silent conversation with something only she could see. Lillian, the quiet one, retreated further into herself. She took to sitting in the library, curled in the window seat, with a book she never seemed to read. She watched the rain trace patterns on the glass, her reflection ghostly in the dim light. When the others spoke to her, she flinched, as if their voices were too loud for her world. And Clara, the youngest, was haunted by dreams. Every night she saw the attic door swing open, saw the figure in the shawl beckoning her forward. She would wake with a cry, her sheets twisted around her, her heart racing. She tried to tell herself it was only a nightmare, but the fear clung to her like a second skin. The sisters avoided the attic. They avoided each other, too, as if the memory of that night was a stain that might spread if they got too close. Meals were silent affairs, the clatter of cutlery loud in the hush. The servants, sensing the change, moved quietly through the house, their eyes averted. But the house itself did not forget. At night, the wind found new ways to moan through the chimneys. Doors that had always stayed shut now creaked open of their own accord. The grandfather clock in the hall began to chime at odd hours, its bell echoing through the empty rooms. One afternoon, as the sisters sat in the drawing room, a sudden chill swept through the house. The fire guttered, and the shadows on the walls seemed to lengthen. Beatrice shivered and pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Eleanor looked up from her embroidery, her face pale. "It's just the wind." But Lillian shook her head. "It's not the wind. It's something else." Clara said nothing. She stared at her hands, remembering the feel of the attic key, the weight of the promise they had made. That night, as the house settled into uneasy silence, Clara crept from her bed and tiptoed down the corridor. She paused outside the attic door, her breath fogging in the cold air. The key was gone, hidden away, but she could feel the presence behind the door, a pressure, a longing. as if the attic itself was waiting for her. She pressed her ear to the wood. For a moment there was only silence. Then, faint and far away, she heard it. A whisper, soft as moth wings. "Promise me?" Clara fled back to her room, her heart pounding. She crawled beneath the covers and pulled them over her head, but the whisper followed her into sleep. In the days that followed, the sisters grew more withdrawn. Eleanor snapped at the servants, her temper fraying. Beatrice wept for no reason, her hands shaking as she tried to write letters home. Lillian stopped speaking altogether, her eyes hollow. Clara watched them, fear growing in her chest. She wanted to tell someone, anyone, what had happened in the attic. But the memory of that night, the memory of the figure's eyes, held her tongue. The house grew colder. The shadows grew longer, and the secret the sisters shared pressed down on them, heavy as a stone. One evening, as the sun set behind the moors and the sky turned the color of bruises, the sisters gathered in Eleanor's room. The air was thick with unspoken words. "We can't go on like this," Eleanor said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "We have to forget. We have to move on." Beatrice shook her head. "How can we? It's always there, watching, waiting." Lillian stared at the floor, her hands clenched in her lap. Clara looked at her sisters, her voice trembling. "What if it comes back?" Eleanor reached for her hand, her grip fierce. "We made a promise. We keep it, no matter what." The sisters nodded, their faces pale in the candlelight. Outside, the wind howled and the house shuddered. In the attic, something listened. Something waited. The days grew shorter and the light in Ashford Manor seemed to fade with the season. The house, always vast and echoing, now felt like a labyrinth of shadows. The sisters moved through it like ghosts, their footsteps muffled by thick carpets, their voices rarely rising above a whisper. Clara felt the change most keenly. She was the youngest, the one who had always been quick to laugh, quick to cry, the one who could coax a smile from even the sternest housemaid. But now laughter seemed a foreign thing, and her world was made of silence and secrets. She tried to keep busy. She helped Mrs. Hargreaves in the kitchen, kneading bread with trembling hands. She read to Lillian in the library, and though Lillian rarely seemed to hear, she walked the gardens with Beatrice, who no longer spoke of the future, but only of the past. And she watched Eleanor, who had become a stranger, her face drawn, her eyes always searching the shadows. But at night, when the house was quiet, and the wind rattled the windows, Clara's thoughts returned to the attic. She dreamed of the figure in the shawl, of its hollow eyes and the way its voice had seemed to seep into her bones. She woke with the taste of dust in her mouth and the memory of a promise she wished she had never made. One morning, as the first frost silvered the lawns, Clara found herself in the nursery, sorting through a box of old toys. She picked up a wooden doll, its paint chipped and faded, and cradled it in her arms. For a moment, she was a child again, safe and unburdened. But then she heard it, a whisper, so soft she thought she had imagined it. "Promise me." Clara dropped the doll. It rolled across the floor and came to rest at the foot of the wardrobe. She stared at it, her heart pounding. She wanted to scream, to run, to tell someone, anyone, what she had heard. But the words caught in her throat. That afternoon, as the sisters sat in the drawing room, a visitor arrived. It was Miss Abernathy, the new governess, sent by their father to restore order in the house. She was young, with kind eyes and a gentle voice, and she seemed to sense the tension that hung over the family. Clara found herself drawn to Miss Abernathy. She lingered after lessons, asking questions, seeking comfort in the governess's calm presence. One evening, As the sun set and the house was bathed in golden light, Clara lingered in the schoolroom, her hands twisting in her lap. "Miss Abernathy," she whispered, "do you believe in ghosts?" The governess smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "I believe in many things, Clara. Why do you ask?" Clara hesitated, the words trembling on her tongue. She wanted to tell her everything, the attic, the promise, the figure in the shawl, but fear held her back. Sometimes I hear things, at night, in the attic." Miss Abernathy's smile faded. "Old houses have old memories, Clara. Sometimes they linger." Clara nodded, but the ache in her chest did not ease. That night the dreams returned. She saw the attic door swing open, saw her sisters standing in a circle, their faces pale and frightened. The figure in the shawl hovered at the center, its eyes fixed on Clara. "Promise me," it whispered. "Promise you'll never tell." Clara woke with a cry, her sheets tangled around her. She pressed her hands to her ears, but the whisper lingered. The next day, Clara could bear it no longer. She found Miss Abernathy in the garden, pruning the last of the roses. The air was cold, and the sky was the color of lead. "Miss Abernathy," Clara said, her voice shaking, "I need to tell you something. Something terrible." The governess set down her shears and knelt beside her. "You can tell me anything, Clara." And so, in a rush of tears and broken words, Clara told her everything. The attic, the figure, the promise, the fear that had settled over the house like a shroud. Miss Abernathy listened in silence, her face grave. When Clara finished, she took her hands and squeezed them gently. "You are very brave, Clara. Secrets can be heavy things, but sometimes sharing them is the only way to be free." Clara felt a weight lift from her shoulders. For the first time in weeks, she could breathe. But that night, the house changed. The wind howled louder. The grandfather clock struck 13. Mirrors cracked, and the fire in the hearth sputtered and died. The sisters woke to find their rooms icy cold, their breath fogging in the air. Eleanor found the attic key on her pillow, though she had hidden it in a locked drawer. Beatrice saw a shadow move across the garden, vanishing among the yews. Lillian heard footsteps in the corridor, soft and shuffling. And Clara, lying awake in the darkness, heard the whisper again, but this time it was angry. "You broke your promise." The next morning, the sisters confronted Clara. Their faces were pale, their eyes wild. "What did you do?" Eleanor demanded. Clara wept. "I'm sorry. I couldn't keep it inside. I told Miss Abernathy." Beatrice slapped her, hard enough to leave a mark. Lillian turned away, her shoulders shaking. Eleanor's voice was cold. "You've doomed us all." The sisters scattered, each alone with her fear. The house groaned and shuddered, as if waking from a long sleep. In the attic, something stirred. The days that followed Clara's confession were marked by a tension so thick it seemed to warp the very air of Ashford Manor. The house, once merely old and creaking, now felt alive, its every groan and sigh a warning, its shadows deeper, its corners colder. The sisters moved through its halls as if pursued, their eyes darting to the attic door at every turn. Beatrice was the first to change. She grew restless, unable to sit still for more than a moment. She wandered the gardens at all hours, her boots leaving muddy tracks across the marble floors. She muttered to herself, her words lost to the wind, and her hands trembled as she clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders. One morning the house awoke to a scream that seemed to shake the very walls. Clara, pale and shaking, found Beatrice's bed empty, the sheets twisted and cold. The window was open, rain blowing in, and muddy footprints led out into the garden. The family and servants searched the grounds, calling Beatrice's name until their voices were hoarse. The garden, once a place of beauty, now seemed wild and menacing. The roses were overgrown, their thorns sharp as knives, and the yew trees cast long finger-like shadows across the grass. It was Eleanor who found her. Beatrice lay at the edge of the pond, her dress soaked and torn, her hair tangled with the weeds. Her eyes were open, staring up at the gray sky, and her lips were parted as if she had been about to speak. In her hand she clutched a scrap of paper, the ink smeared by rain. Eleanor knelt beside her, her own tears lost in the drizzle. She pried the paper from Beatrice's stiff fingers and read the single word written there over and over in a trembling hand. Promise. The family doctor was summoned, but there was nothing to be done. Beatrice was gone, her body cold, her spirit fled. The official cause was declared an accident, a fall perhaps, or a fainting spell by the water's edge, but the sisters knew better. The house fell into mourning. Black crepe was hung from the mirrors, and the clocks were stopped at the hour Beatrice was found. The servants moved quietly, their faces drawn, and the sisters retreated into their grief. Eleanor became a shadow of herself, her eyes hollow, her voice flat. She spent hours in the chapel, praying for forgiveness, her hands clenched so tightly around her rosary that her knuckles bled. Lillian grew more silent, her gaze fixed on some distant point only she could see. Clara, racked with guilt, wandered the halls at night, her footsteps echoing in the emptiness. The attic door remained closed, but the sisters felt its presence everywhere. At night they heard footsteps overhead, slow and deliberate. Sometimes a cold draft would sweep through the house, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and old roses. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of red and gold, Clara found herself drawn to the garden. She stood at the edge of the pond, staring at the place where Beatrice had been found. The water was still, reflecting the bruised sky. A single rose floated on the surface, its petals dark as blood. Clara knelt and whispered a prayer, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry, Beatrice. I'm so sorry." A chill ran through her, and she looked up to see a figure standing among the yews. For a moment, she thought it was her sister, come back to forgive her. But as the figure stepped into the fading light, Clara saw that its face was hidden in shadow, its eyes black and empty. "Promise me," it whispered, the words curling through the air like smoke. Clara stumbled back, her heart pounding. She fled to the house, slamming the door behind her. But the whisper followed her, echoing in her mind. That night, the sisters gathered in Eleanor's room, their faces pale in the candlelight. "It's not over," Eleanor said, her voice barely more than a breath. "We broke the pact. Now it's coming for us." Lillian shivered, her eyes wide. "What do we do?" Eleanor looked at her sisters, her jaw set. "We keep the promise. We say nothing. To anyone, ever again." Clara nodded, tears streaming down her face. But in her heart she knew it was too late. The secret had been spoken, and the price had been paid in blood. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, and the house shuddered. In the attic, something waited, patient and hungry. The days after Beatrice's funeral passed in a haze of rain and silence. Ashford Manor, once a place of laughter and music, now felt like a mausoleum. The black crepe on the mirrors fluttered in every draft, and the clocks remained stopped, as if time itself had abandoned the house. Eleanor moved through the halls like a ghost, her face pale and drawn. She spent her mornings in the chapel, her afternoons in the library, and her nights pacing the corridors, unable to sleep. She prayed for forgiveness, but the words felt hollow, echoing back at her from the cold stone walls. Lillian grew quieter still. She no longer joined her sisters for meals, preferring to sit in the window seat of her bedroom, staring out at the rain-soaked gardens. Sometimes Clara would find her there, lips moving in silent conversation with someone only she could see. When Clara asked who she was talking to, Lillian would only shake her head and turn away. Clara herself was haunted by guilt. She saw Beatrice everywhere, in the garden, in the flicker of candlelight, in the shadows that pooled at the foot of her bed. She heard her sister's voice in the wind, in the creak of the floorboards, in the soft, insistent whisper that seemed to follow her from room to room. Promise me. The house was changing. Doors that had always stayed shut now swung open in the night, revealing empty rooms filled with cold, swirling air. The servants whispered of strange happenings. Footsteps in the attic, the sound of weeping in the halls, mirrors that fogged over with no breath to mist them. Mrs. Hargreaves, the housekeeper, began to carry a rosary in her apron pocket, and the maids refused to go upstairs after dark. One evening, as the sisters sat together in the drawing room, a sudden chill swept through the house. The fire guttered, and the shadows on the walls seemed to lengthen and twist. Eleanor shivered and pulled her shawl tighter. "Did you feel that?" she whispered. Clara nodded, her eyes wide. "He's colder than before." Lillian's gaze was fixed on the far corner of the room, where the darkness seemed to pulse and breathe. "She's here," she said softly. "Beatrice is here." Eleanor's hands trembled. "Don't say that." But Lillian only smiled, a strange, sad smile. "She's not angry. She's just waiting." That night, Clara woke to the sound of footsteps in the corridor. She sat up, her heart pounding, and listened as the steps paused outside her door. The handle turned, and the door creaked open. For a moment, she saw a figure standing in the doorway, a girl in a white nightgown, her hair tangled, her face pale and wet with tears. "Beatrice?" Clara whispered. The figure stepped into the room, her bare feet leaving wet prints on the floor. She crossed to the bed and sat beside Clara, her eyes dark and empty. "You promised," she whispered, her voice echoing with sorrow and accusation. "You promised you'd never tell." Clara sobbed, reaching for her sister, but her hands passed through empty air. The figure faded, leaving only the scent of roses and the chill of the grave. The next morning, Clara found a single rose on her pillow, its petals black and curling at the edges. The hauntings grew worse. Lillian began to speak in her sleep, her voice low and urgent. "Don't open the door. Don't let her in." Eleanor found the attic key in her pocket, though she had locked it away in a drawer. The servants reported seeing a girl in white wandering the halls at night, her face hidden by her hair. The sisters grew afraid of the dark, afraid of the attic, afraid of each other. They spoke in whispers, their words heavy with fear and regret. One afternoon, as a storm raged outside, Eleanor gathered her sisters in the chapel. The stained glass windows cast strange, shifting colors on their faces. "We have to do something," Eleanor said, her voice trembling. "We can't go on like this." Lillian stared at the altar, her eyes unfocused. "She wants us to remember. She wants us to keep the promise." Clara shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." Eleanor took her sister's hands, her grip fierce. "We made a vow. We have to find a way to make it right." As the storm thundered overhead, the sisters knelt together in the chapel, their prayers rising into the darkness. But outside the wind howled, and in the attic, something listened, waiting for its due. That night, as the house settled into uneasy silence, the sisters heard a new sound, a soft, persistent tapping from above. The attic door rattled on its hinges, and the whisper came again, louder than before. "Promise me." The storm that night was the worst yet. Lightning forked across the sky, illuminating Ashford Manor in stark, trembling flashes. Thunder rolled over the moors, shaking the windows in their frames. The house seemed to shrink from the violence, its old timbers groaning, its shadows deepening. Eleanor lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the attic's weight pressing down on her chest. The tapping had not stopped. It had grown louder, more insistent, as if something above was desperate to be heard. She could feel it in her bones, a summons, a demand. She rose from her bed and wrapped herself in her dressing gown. The candle on her nightstand flickered as she lit it, casting a trembling circle of light. She hesitated at her door, listening. Down the corridor she heard footsteps, soft, hesitant, familiar. Lillian and Clara emerged from the darkness, their faces pale, their eyes wide. "We heard it too," Lillian whispered, clutching her shawl. Clara nodded, her lips bloodless. "It won't stop. Not until we go." For a moment, the three sisters stood in silence, the storm raging around them. Then, wordlessly, they moved together down the corridor, their bare feet silent on the cold floorboards. The attic door loomed ahead, its keyhole a black, unblinking eye. Eleanor reached into her pocket and drew out the key. She did not remember putting it there, but it was warm in her hand, as if it had been waiting for her. She slid it into the lock, and the door swung open with a sigh. The attic was colder than they remembered. The air was thick with dust and the scent of old roses. Shadows clung to the beams, and the candlelight seemed to shrink from the corners. The sisters stepped inside, their breaths clouding in the chill. The tapping stopped. In the center of the attic, beneath the grimy window, stood a small table. On it rested a cracked porcelain doll, its eyes wide and unblinking, its dress stained and torn. Around the table, 4 chairs were arranged in a circle, one for each sister. The 4th chair was empty. Eleanor's hand shook as she raised the candle. "This is where it happened," she whispered. Lillian's voice was barely audible. "Do you remember?" Clara nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I remember everything." The memory came flooding back, sharp and cold as the wind that rattled the eaves. That night, months ago, they had been drawn to the attic by the same tapping, the same sense of dread. They had found the table, the doll, the 4 chairs, and in the 4th chair, a figure, small, hunched, wrapped in a tattered shawl. It had looked up at them with eyes black as midnight. It had spoken in a voice that was not a child's nor a woman's, but something older, something hungry. "Promise me," it had whispered. "Promise you'll never tell." They had promised, their voices trembling, their hands joined. The figure had smiled, a terrible, broken smile. The candle had gone out, and when they relit it, the chair was empty. Now, as the sisters stood in the attic, the air grew colder still. The doll's eyes seemed to follow them, and the shadows pressed closer. Eleanor stepped forward, her voice shaking. "We broke the promise. We told." The attic seemed to shudder. The wind howled, and the candle flickered violently. Lillian clutched her sister's arm. "What do we do?" Clara's voice was a whisper. "We have to finish it. We have to face her." As if in answer, the shadows in the far corner of the attic began to move. The figure emerged just as before, small, hunched, wrapped in a shawl. Its face was hidden, but its eyes glowed in the darkness. "You broke your promise," it hissed. "You let the secret out." The sisters shrank back, but Eleanor stood her ground. "We're sorry. We were afraid." The figure's voice was a cold wind. "Fear is no excuse. The pact was made. The price must be paid." The attic filled with a sudden, biting cold. The candle went out, plunging the room into darkness. The sisters clung to each other, their hearts pounding. In the blackness, the figure's voice echoed all around them. "Remember what you saw. Remember what you did." The memory rose, unbidden and unstoppable. That night, months ago, they had not been alone in the attic. There had been another, a 5th child, a cousin or a friend, her name lost to time. She had dared them to play a game, to summon a spirit. They had laughed, not believing, not understanding. But something had answered. The game had turned to terror, and in the chaos, the fifth child had fallen, her head striking the table. Blood had pooled on the floor, and the sisters had fled, swearing never to speak of it. The figure in the shawl stepped closer, its face now visible in the faint light from the window. It was the fifth child, her eyes hollow, her mouth twisted in grief and rage. "You left me here," she whispered. "You let me die alone." Clara sobbed, falling to her knees. "We were children. We didn't know." The spirit's gaze was merciless. "A promise is a promise. You must pay." The attic shook, dust falling from the beams. The sisters felt the weight of their guilt, the crushing burden of the secret they had tried to bury. Eleanor bowed her head. "We're sorry. We're so sorry." The spirit's eyes softened just for a moment. "Remember me. Tell the truth. Only then will you be free." The wind died. The cold receded. The figure faded, leaving only the doll on the table, its eyes now closed. The sisters stood in silence, the truth heavy in the air. They had made a pact and broken it. They had tried to hide from their guilt, but it had found them as it always would. As they left the attic, the door swung shut behind them. The key turned in the lock, and this time, Eleanor placed it on the mantel in full view. No more secrets, no more lies. But as they descended the stairs, a new fear took root. The price had not yet been fully paid. And in the shadows of Ashford Manor, something still waited. The days after their return to the attic passed in a feverish blur. The sisters moved through Ashford Manor as if in a trance, haunted by the memory of what they had seen and what they had done. The truth, once buried, now pressed against every wall, seeped into every shadow and echoed in every footstep. Eleanor tried to keep the household together. She insisted on meals at the long dining table, on prayers in the chapel, on the routines that had once given their lives shape. But the servants, already uneasy, now looked at the sisters with open fear. The maids whispered of cold spots and flickering lights, of a child's laughter in empty rooms, of the attic door rattling in the night. Lillian was the most changed. She grew pale and thin, her eyes ringed with shadows. She spoke little, and when she did, her words were strange, half-remembered nursery rhymes, warnings in a voice not quite her own. She spent hours in the garden, standing motionless among the yews, her nightdress fluttering in the wind. Clara watched her with growing dread. She wanted to reach out, to comfort her sister, but every time she tried, Lillian flinched away, her gaze fixed on something only she could see. One morning the house awoke to a silence so deep it seemed to swallow sound. The rain had stopped, and a pale, watery sun filtered through the windows. Eleanor found Lillian's bed empty, the sheets cold and undisturbed. A sense of déjà vu gripped her heart. She searched the house, calling Lillian's name, her voice echoing through the empty halls. Clara joined her, her face white with fear. Together they scoured every room, every corridor, every shadowed corner. The attic door was still locked, the key untouched on the mantel. It was in the garden that they found her. Lillian stood at the edge of the pond, her feet bare, her nightdress trailing in the mud. Her hair was loose, tangled with leaves and dew. She stared into the water, her reflection wavering in the ripples. She walked forward, unblinking, until the water reached her chin. Then, with a final, shuddering breath, she slipped beneath the surface. Eleanor screamed, plunging into the pond after her. Clara followed, the cold water stealing her breath. They searched, their hands grasping at weeds and mud, but Lillian was gone, swallowed by the dark, silent water. The servants dragged the pond, but it was hours before they found her. Lillian's body was pale and still, her hair fanned out like a halo. In her hand, she clutched a single blackened rose. The doctor declared it a tragic accident, a fit of melancholy brought on by grief. But the sisters knew better. The house knew better. That night the manor was quieter than ever. The clocks did not chime. The wind did not howl. The only sound was the slow, steady drip of water from the eaves. Eleanor sat by the fire, her hands wrapped around a cup of cold tea. Clara sat beside her, shivering, her eyes fixed on the flames. "We're cursed," Clara whispered. "We broke the promise, and now it's taking us one by one." Eleanor's voice was flat, empty. "We have to end it. We have to tell the truth." Clara shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "It won't matter. It's too late." Eleanor looked at her, her eyes fierce. "It's never too late. We owe it to them. To Beatrice. To Lillian. To her." The fire flickered, casting long shadows on the walls. In the silence they heard it. The soft, persistent tapping from above. The attic was calling. That night Clara dreamed of the attic. She saw the 4 chairs, the doll on the table, the 5th child waiting in the shadows. The girl's eyes were full of sorrow, but also of hope. "Remember me," she whispered. "Tell them what happened. Only then will you be free." Clara woke with a start, the words burning in her mind. The next morning, Eleanor found her in the chapel, kneeling before the altar, her hands clasped in prayer. "We have to tell them," Clara said, her voice trembling. "We have to tell everyone what happened." Eleanor nodded, her resolve hardening. "We will. Tonight." Outside, the sun rose over Ashford Manor, its light pale and thin. The house seemed to sigh, as if bracing itself for what was to come. But in the attic, the shadows gathered, patient and watchful. The pact was broken, and the price was not yet paid. The day of Lillian's funeral dawned gray and cold, the sky heavy with unfallen rain. Ashford Manor was draped in black, its windows shuttered, its halls echoing with the footsteps of mourners and the low, sorrowful hum of prayers. The sisters' world had shrunk to a handful of rooms and a single, unspoken purpose: to survive the curse that had claimed half their number. Eleanor moved through the house like a wraith, her face pale and set, her eyes rimmed with sleeplessness. She wore her mourning dress like armor, her hands clenched in white gloves. Clara followed her everywhere, silent and watchful, her own grief a shadow that clung to her like a second skin. After the service, as the last of the villagers drifted away and the rain began to fall in earnest, Eleanor led Clara to the chapel. The air inside was cold and still, the candles guttering in their sconces. The stained glass cast bruised colors on the stone floor, and the scent of lilies, Lillian's favorite, hung heavy in the air. Eleanor knelt at the altar, her head bowed. Clara joined her, their shoulders touching. "We can't keep this secret any longer," Eleanor whispered, her voice raw. "It's killing us. It's killing everyone." Clara's hands trembled in her lap. "What if it doesn't help? What if it only makes things worse?" Eleanor looked at her, her eyes fierce and bright. "It can't be worse than this." She rose and crossed to the old writing desk in the corner, pulling out a leather-bound diary. She opened it to a blank page and began to write, her pen scratching furiously across the paper. "To whoever finds this, know that we tried to do what was right. Know that we were only children and that we were afraid." Clara watched, her heart pounding. She remembered the attic, the game, the 5th child's laughter turning to screams, the blood on the floorboards. She remembered the promise, the way the figure in the shawl had looked at them, hungry, betrayed. Eleanor wrote everything. The night in the attic, The pact, the hauntings, the deaths. She wrote until her hand cramped and her eyes blurred with tears. When she finished, she tore the page from the diary and pressed it into Clara's hands. "We'll give this to Father," she said. "He'll know what to do." But as they left the chapel, the house seemed to close in around them. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper. The wind howled down the chimneys, rattling the windows and making the candles flicker. That night, as the sisters sat together in Eleanor's room, the storm returned. Lightning flashed, illuminating the attic door at the end of the corridor. The tapping began again, louder than ever, insistent and wild. Eleanor stood, her jaw set. "It wants us to finish it." Clara clutched the confession to her chest. "I'm scared." Eleanor took her hand. "We'll go together." They crept down the corridor, and floorboards groaning beneath their feet. The attic key was still on the mantel, gleaming in the candlelight. Eleanor took it and unlocked the door. The attic was colder than ever, the air thick with the scent of roses and something older, something rotten. The table and chairs were as they had left them, the doll's eyes open and unblinking. The figure in the shawl waited in the shadows, her face pale and sad. "You're here," she whispered. "At last." Eleanor stepped forward, her voice steady. "We're sorry. We should have told the truth from the beginning." Clara held out the confession, her hands shaking. "We remember you. We'll never forget." The figure smiled, a slow, sorrowful smile. "That is all I ever wanted." The attic filled with a sudden blinding light. The wind died. The tapping stopped. When the sisters opened their eyes, the figure was gone. The doll's eyes were closed. The air was warm, and the scent of lilies filled the room. Eleanor and Clara stood in silence, the weight of years lifting from their shoulders. "We did it," Clara whispered. "We're free." But as they left the attic, the house shuddered, and a new fear took root. The truth had been spoken, but the price had not yet been fully paid. Downstairs, the front door banged open, and their father's voice echoed through the halls. "Eleanor, Clara, where are you?" The sisters exchanged a glance, the confession clutched between them. "It's time," Eleanor said. "Let's finish this." The storm had passed, but Ashford Manor was restless. The air was thick and heavy, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Shadows clung to the corners of every room, and the silence was so deep that even the ticking of the grandfather clock seemed muffled, uncertain. Eleanor and Clara stood in the foyer, the confession clutched between them. Their father's voice echoed from the drawing room, sharp with worry and anger. He had returned at last, his face gaunt from weeks away, his eyes darting from daughter to daughter as if searching for the girls he remembered, not the haunted young women before him. "What is this?" he demanded, snatching the paper from Eleanor's hand. His eyes scanned the confession, his brow furrowing, his lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. Eleanor's voice was steady, but her hands trembled. "It's the truth, Father. All of it. We can't keep it hidden anymore." He read in silence, the only sound the crackle of the fire and the distant rumble of thunder. When he finished, he looked up, his face ashen. "This is madness," he whispered. "You were children. It was an accident. Why bring it up now?" Clara stepped forward, her voice small but clear. "Because it's not over. The house, the spirit, she won't let us go." Their father's eyes flicked to the ceiling as if he too could hear the faint tapping from the attic. He shook his head, but his hands shook as he folded the confession and tucked it into his coat. "We'll speak no more of this," he said. "Tomorrow I'll send for the vicar. We'll have the attic blessed, and that will be the end of it." But the sisters knew better. The house was listening. The pact was not yet satisfied. That night the wind rose again, rattling the windows and moaning through the chimneys. The candles flickered, and the shadows on the walls seemed to move of their own accord. The servants locked themselves in their rooms, whispering prayers and clutching rosaries. Eleanor and Clara sat together in Eleanor's room, the attic key between them. Neither spoke, but both knew what must be done. At midnight the tapping began, soft at first, then louder, more insistent. The air grew cold, and the scent of lilies and old roses filled the corridor. Eleanor stood, her face pale but resolute. "It's time." Clara nodded, her heart pounding. Together they crept down the hall, the floorboards groaning beneath their feet. The attic door loomed ahead, the keyhole a black, hungry mouth. Eleanor fitted the key into the lock. The door swung open with a sigh, and a cold wind swept past them, carrying the sound of distant laughter and weeping. The attic was as they remembered, dusty, cluttered, the table and chairs waiting in the center. The doll sat on the table, its eyes open, its mouth twisted in a silent scream. The figure in the shawl stood by the window, her back to the sisters. Moonlight spilled across the floor, painting her shadow long and thin. Eleanor stepped forward, her voice trembling. "We're here. We're ready." The figure turned. It was the fifth child, her face pale and beautiful, her eyes dark with sorrow. "You broke your promise," she whispered. "You left me alone." Clara's tears fell freely. "We're sorry. We were afraid. We were only children." The spirit's gaze softened, but her voice was cold. "Fear is no excuse. You must finish what you started." Eleanor took Clara's hand. "Tell us what to do." The spirit pointed to the table. "Sit, all of you." The sisters obeyed, their hands joined, their breaths shallow. The spirit sat in the fourth chair, her presence cold and heavy. "Speak the truth," she commanded. "Say my name." Eleanor's voice was barely a whisper. "Alice. Your name was Alice." The attic shuddered. The wind howled. The doll's eyes closed. "Tell them what happened," Alice said. "Tell them I was here. Tell them I mattered." Clara nodded, her voice breaking. "We will. We promise." The spirit smiled, a sad, gentle smile. "Then I am free." A sudden warmth filled the attic. The shadows receded. The air grew sweet. The doll's face softened, its eyes closing in peace. Alice's form faded, her outline dissolving into moonlight. The sisters sat in silence, the weight of years lifting from their shoulders. Eleanor rose, her legs trembling. She took the confession from her pocket and placed it on the table beside the doll. "It's over," she whispered. "We're free." Clara hugged her, sobbing with relief and sorrow. As they left the attic, the door swung shut behind them. The key turned in the lock, and this time it stayed there. Downstairs, the house was quiet. The wind had died, and the first light of dawn crept across the moors. The curse was broken. The pact was fulfilled. But as the sisters embraced in the pale morning light, they knew they would never forget the price they had paid for silence and for truth. Years passed, and the story of Ashford Manor faded into the mists that rolled across the Yorkshire moors. The house, once alive with laughter and secrets, stood silent and empty, its windows blind, its gardens wild. Ivy crept up the stone walls, and the iron gates rusted shut. The villagers spoke of the place in hushed tones, warning children not to wander too close after dark. Inside, dust settled on the grand staircase and the portraits of the Ashford family, their painted eyes watching over empty halls. The attic door remained locked, the key still in its place, untouched by living hands. Only the wind moved through the rooms, carrying with it the faint scent of lilies and old roses. Clara was the last. She lived for many years in a small cottage on the edge of the village, her hair turning silver, her back bent with age. She rarely spoke of the manor or her sisters, but sometimes, on stormy nights, she would sit by the fire and stare into the flames, her eyes distant, her lips moving in silent conversation with ghosts. She kept the confession Eleanor had written, folded and yellowed, in a wooden box beside her bed. Sometimes she would take it out and read it, her hands trembling, her heart heavy with memory. She wondered if anyone would ever truly understand what had happened in the attic, or the price they had paid for their silence. One autumn evening, as the wind rattled the windows and the first leaves fell from the trees, Clara felt the end drawing near. She lit a candle and sat at her writing desk, the confession before her. She took up her pen and began to write, her words slow but steady. To whoever finds this, know that we loved each other, even in our fear. Know that we tried to do what was right, though we failed. The secret we kept was not just ours, but the houses and the lands and the shadows that linger where children once laughed. Forgive us, if you can. Remember us, if you will. When she finished, she placed the letter with the confession and sealed the box. She set it on the windowsill, where the morning sun would find it. That night, Clara dreamed of her sisters. She saw Eleanor, strong and proud, her arms open and welcome. She saw Beatrice and Lillian, their faces young and untroubled, their laughter echoing through the halls. And she saw Alice, the fifth child, her eyes bright, her smile gentle. "We're together now," Alice whispered. "You kept your promise." Clara smiled in her sleep, her heart finally at peace. When the villagers found her the next morning, she was sitting by the window, the candle burned down to a pool of wax, the box resting in her lap. She looked peaceful, as if she had simply drifted away. The box passed from hand to hand, its contents read and reread. The story of the Ashford sisters whispered from one generation to the next. Some said the manor was cursed, others that it was haunted by love and regret. But all agreed that the truth, once spoken, had set the sisters free. Years later, when the manor was finally opened again, the new owners found the attic key still in its place. They unlocked the door and found the attic unchanged. The table, the 4 chairs, the porcelain doll with its eyes closed in sleep. The air was sweet with the scent of lilies, and the morning light poured through the window, painting the dust in gold. No one ever saw the spirit of the 5th child again. But sometimes, on stormy nights, the villagers would see a light in the attic window and hear the faint sound of laughter, soft, innocent, and free. The Ashford Sisters Pact had cost them dearly. But in the end, it was not the secret that destroyed them, but the silence. And in the telling, at last, they found peace.